In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to take advantage of scene layers inside of Softimage. So within Softimage, we actually have the ability to take different parts of our scene and organize them and break them apart based on layers. So really this becomes a really nice organizational feature that becomes really useful as we start to get into more complex scenes and more complex setups. So to find your layers, this is actually going to be found over in the Keying panel and Layers tab. So if we click on that, you can see that actually brings up this transform or this keying panel, and down toward the bottom we have our layers. Now within Softimage we really have two different layer types. We have animation layers and scene layers. Now in animation layers this really has to do with animation and keyframes, so for now we're just going to focus on the scene layers. Now we'll just click on this and move this up so this is a little bit easier to access. So right now we have our default layer, and really everything that you create in Softimage will get added to this default layer. Now if we start to add new layers, we can start to again organize and break our scene up. So let's say for example we had this orange cube and we'd like to have this isolated on its own layer. Maybe we want this to be in a method where we actually are not able to select it. So let's actually grab this cube with that selected. Let's go to create, and we can either make a new layer or we can make a new layer and automatically add the objects to them. So let's start with that, and you can see now that this particular cube has been added into this layer. Now if at any point in time you're not sure what is actually contained on a layer, we could actually right click on that and ask Softimage to select any objects that are currently contained on that layer. In this case you can see it selects that cube. Now, whenever working with a layer, we have these different checkboxes. So we have things like the visibility. So if I turn that V checkbox off, you can see that object basically disappears. Now, here's something to keep in mind. Even though an object is not visible in the viewport, that does not mean that the object is not able to be rendered. So if I were to press and hold the Q key on my keyboard, draw out a render region, you can see that that cube is still visible in my render. Now, to remove that, we actually have this render checkbox. So if we turn off that checkbox, now this object is not able to be rendered within any kind of a render. Now we could turn the visibility back on, so that way an object is still visible in the viewport, but maybe we actually don't want that object to be rendered. We also have the ability to disable an object selection. So as I mentioned, there may be situations where maybe we don't want an object to be selected. We want this placed and we don't want this to ever move by accident. So we could disable the selection checkbox, and now you can see as I try to click on this cube, nothing happens. I'm no longer able to actually select that. However, I can select everything else. Now something to keep in mind is that when it comes to start working with layers, the actual layer that you have selected or active, any new objects that you create at this point will be added onto that active layer. So let's say for example I had this visibility checked off. Now let's come in and we'll go to get primitive and we'll add just a piece of test geometry. Let's add a NURBS or rather a surface torus, and if I press and hold the V key on my keyboard and try to move this around, you'll notice that we don't see that torus. Doesn't seem like it's been added into our scene. Well, the fact is, it has been added, but it's been added onto this layer, and unfortunately that layer has any objects assigned to it set to be invisible. Now if I turn the visibility back on, you can see here's our torus. So it starts to become very important as you start working with layers to make sure that you have the proper layer active whenever you start to add, let's say, new pieces of geometry or new objects into your scene. So what if we do find ourselves in that kind of a situation where we have maybe a piece of geometry or an object that has been added onto a layer that we didn't want? Well, what we can do is go in and let's just select that piece of geometry. If it's not able to be selected, just make sure that you have your selection option turned on for that layer. And now just to make sure that this actually works, let's select this object. We can right click on our layer and tell Softimage to remove any objects or remove the selected objects from the particular layer. And actually what we need to do is select a layer that we want Softimage to move that object to. So if I want this torus to be back on this default layer, let's just come in here and check that, select it, come down, and tell Softimage to move that object to this layer. Now what we should see is if we go back to this layer, turn off the visibility, you'll notice that nothing happens. That's because now this torus is not on that layer anymore. So as I said, these layers become extremely useful for being able to come in and actually organize our scenes. And as we start to progress a little bit further through this training and start to build up some more complex objects and some things that go along with that, you'll start to see some practical examples of where these scene layers can be used. So that's a look at how we can start to create these different layers and assign objects to them.